Hello, listening squirrels. Hope y'all are having a happy Thursday. Get my days right. I'm a little chilly, so I got my Jaxie hug on today. Let's see, we're at chapter 3 of the Upper Berth. Hope it's exciting. Been drinking some red drink. Matches my shirt. We played whilst in the evening, and I went to bed late. I will confess now that I felt a disagreeable sensation when I entered my stateroom. I could not help thinking of the tall man I had seen on the previous night, who was now dead, drowned, tossing about in the long swell 200 or 300 miles astern. His face rose very distinctly before me as I undressed, and I even went so far as to draw back the curtains on the upper berth, as though to persuade myself that he was actually gone. I also bolted the door of the stateroom. Suddenly I became aware that the porthole was open again. I fastened it back. This was more than I could stand. I hastily threw on my dressing gown and went in search of Robert, the steward of my passage. I was very angry, I remember, when I found him and dragged him roughly to the door of 105 and pushed him towards the open porthole. "What the deuce do you mean, you scoundrel, by leaving that port open every night? Don't you know it's against the regulations? Don't you know that if the ship heeled and the water began to come in, 10 men could not shut it? I will report you to the captain, you blackguard, for endangering the ship." I was exceedingly wroth. The man trembled and turned pale, and then began to shut the round glass plate with the heavy brass fittings. "Why don't you answer me?" I said roughly. "If you please, sir," faltered Robert, "there's nobody on board as can keep this 'ere port shut at night. You can try it yourself, sir. I ain't a-going to stop any longer on board of this vessel, sir. I ain't indeed, but if I was you, sir, I'd just clear out and go and sleep with the surgeon or something, I would. Look here, sir, is that fastened what you may call securely or not, sir? Try it, sir, see if it will move a hinch." I tried the port and found it perfectly tight. "Well, sir," continued Robert triumphantly, "I wager my reputation as an A1 steward that in half an hour it will be open again, fastened back too, sir. That's the horrible thing, fastened back." I examined the great screw and the loop nut that ran on it. "If I find it open in the night, Robert, I will give you a sovereign. If I find it open in the night, Robert, I will give you a sovereign. It is not possible. You may go." "Sovereign, did you say, sir? Very good, sir. Thank you, sir. Good night, sir. Pleasant repose, sir, and all manner of enchanting dreams, sir." It's kind of hard to read what he says. Robert scuttled away, delighted at being released. Of course, I thought he was trying to account for his negligence by a silly story intended to frighten me, and I disbelieved him. The consequence was that he got his sovereign, and I spent a very peculiarly unpleasant night. I went to bed, and 5 minutes after I had rolled myself in my blankets, the inexorable Robert extinguished the lights that burned steadily behind the ground glass pane near the door. I lay quite still in the dark, trying to go to sleep, but I soon found that impossible. It had been some satisfaction to be angry with the steward, and the diversion had banished that unpleasant sensation I had at first experienced when I thought of the drowned man who had been my chum. Not really. But I was no longer sleepy, and lay awake for some time, occasionally glancing at the porthole, which I could just see from where I lay, and which in the darkness looked like a faintly luminous soup plate suspended in the blackness. I believe I must have lain there for an hour, and as I remember, I was just dozing into sleep when I was roused by a draught of cold air, and by distinctly feeling the spray of the sea blown upon my face, I started to my feet, and not having allowed in the dark for the motion of the ship, I was instantly thrown violently across the stateroom upon the couch, which was placed beneath the porthole. I recovered myself immediately. However, I climbed upon my knees. The porthole was again wide opened and fastened back. Now, these things are facts. I was wide awake when I got up, and I should certainly have been waked by the fall. And had I still been dozing? Hang on. Should certainly have been waked by the fall had I still been dozing. Okay. Moreover, I bruised my elbows and knees badly, and the bruises were there on the following morning to testify to the fact, if I myself had doubted it. The porthole was wide open, fastened back, a thing so accountable that I remembered very well feeling astonishment rather than fear when I discovered it. I at once closed the plate again and screwed down the loop nut with all my strength. It was very dark in the stateroom. I reflected that the port had certainly been opened within an hour after Robert had first shut it in my presence, and I determined to watch it and see whether it would open again. Those brass fittings are very heavy and by no means easy to move. I could not believe that the clamp had been turned by the shaking of the screw. I stood peering out through the thick glass at the alternate white and gray streaks of the sea that had foamed beneath the ship's side. I must have remained there a quarter of an hour. Tea break. Wet my whistle break. Good and warm. Good and warm, and I hope I said tea and not wine. Must have remained there a quarter of an hour. Suddenly, as I stood, I distinctly heard something moving behind me in one of the berths, and a moment afterwards, just as I turned instinctively to look, though I could, of course, see nothing in the darkness, I heard a very faint groan. I sprang across the stateroom and tore the curtains of the upper berth aside, thrusting in my hands to discover if there were anyone there. There was someone. I remember that the sensation as I put my hands forward was as though I was plunging them into the air of a damp cellar, and from behind the curtains came a gust of wind that smelled horribly of stagnant seawater. I laid hold of something that had the shape of a man's arm, but was smooth and wet and icy cold. But suddenly as I pulled, the creature sprang violently forward against me. A clammy, oozy mass, as it seemed to me, heavy and wet, yet endowed with a sort of supernatural strength. I reeled across the stateroom. In an instant the door opened and the thing rushed out. I had not had time to be frightened and quickly recovered myself. I sprang through the door and gave chase at the top of my speed, but was too late. 10 yards before me I could see, and I am sure I saw it, a dark shadow moving in the dimly lighted passage, quickly as the shadow of a fast horse thrown before a dog cart by the lamp on a dark night. But in a moment it had disappeared, and I found myself holding on to the polished rail that ran along the bulkhead where the passage turned towards the companion. My hair stood on end, and a cold perspiration rolled down my face. I'm not ashamed of it in the least. I was very badly frightened. Still, I doubted my senses and pulled myself together. It was absurd, I thought. The Welsh rarebit I had eaten had disagreed with me. I had been in a nightmare. I made my way back to the stateroom and entered it with an effort. The whole place smelled of stagnant seawater as it had when I had waked on the previous evening. It required my utmost strength to go in and grope among my things for a box of wax lights. As I lighted a railway reading lantern, which I always carry in case I want to read after the lamps are out, I perceived that the porthole was what? Open again. And a sort of creeping horror began to take possession of me, which I never felt before, nor wished to feel again. But I got a light and proceeded to examine the upper berth, expecting to find it drenched with seawater. But I was disappointed. The bed had been slept in, and the smell of the sea was strong, but the bedding was as dry as a bone. I fancy that Robert had not had the courage to make the bed after the accident of the previous night. It had all been a hideous dream. I drew the curtains back as far as I could and examined the place very carefully. It was perfectly dry, but the porthole was open again. With a sort of dull bewilderment of horror, I closed it, screwed it down, and thrusting my heavy stick through the brass loop, wrenched it with all my might till the thick metal began to bend under the pressure. Then I hooked my reading lantern into the red velvet at the head of the couch and sat down to recover my senses if I could. I sat there all night, unable to think of rest, hardly able to think at all. But the porthole remained closed, and I did not believe it would now open without the application of a considerable force. The morning dawned at last, and I dressed myself slowly, thinking over all that had happened in the night. It was a beautiful day, and I went on deck, glad to get out in the early pure sunshine and to smell the breeze from the blue water, so different from the noisome, stagnant odor of my stateroom. Instinctively, I turned aft towards the surgeon's cabin. There he stood, with a pipe in his mouth, taking his morning airing precisely as on the preceding day. "Good morning," said he quietly, but looking at me with evident curiosity. "Doctor, you were quite right," said I. "There's something wrong about that place." "I thought you would change your mind," he answered rather triumphantly. "You have had a bad night, eh? Shall I make you a pick-me-up? I have a capital recipe." "No, thanks," I cried, "but I would like to tell you what happened." I then tried to explain as clearly as possible precisely what had occurred, not omitting to state that I had been scared as I had never been scared in my whole life before. I dwelt particularly on the phenomenon of the porthole, which was a fact which I could testify, even if the rest had been an illusion. I closed it twice in the night, and the second time I'd actually bent the brass in wrenching it with my stick, I believe. I insisted a good deal on this point. "You seem to think I'm likely to doubt the story," said the doctor, smiling at my detailed account of the state of the porthole. "I do not doubt in the least. I renew my invitation to you. Bring your traps here and take half my cabin." "Come and take half of mine for one night," I said. "Help me to get to the bottom of this thing." "You'll get to the bottom of something else if you try it," answered the doctor. "What?" I asked. "The bottom of the sea. I'm going to leave this ship. It is not canny." "Then you will not help me to find out?" "Not I," said the doctor quickly. "It's my business to keep my wits about me, not to go fiddling about with ghosts and things." "Do you really believe it's a ghost?" I inquired rather contemptuously, but as I spoke I remembered very well the horrible sensation of the supernatural which had got possession of me during the night. The doctor turned sharply on me. "Have you any reasonable explanation of these things to offer?" he asked. "No, you have not. Will you say you will find an explanation?" "I say you won't, sir, simply because there is not any." "But, my dear sir," I retorted, "do you, a man of science, mean to tell me that such things cannot be explained?" "I do," he answered stoutly, "and if they could, I would not be concerned in the explanation. I do not care to spend another night alone in that stateroom, and yet I was obstinately determined to get at the root of the disturbances. I do not believe there are many men who would have slept there alone after passing 2 such nights. But I made up my mind to try it if I could not get anyone to share a watch with me." The doctor was evidently not inclined for such an experiment. He said he was a surgeon and that in case any accident occurred on board, he must be always in readiness. He could not afford to have his nerves unsettled. Perhaps he was quite right, but I'm inclined to think that his precaution was prompted by his inclination. Oh, I forgot to turn on the pretty light. And I'm probably almost done now. Oh well. After a little more conversation, I left him. A little later, I met the captain and told him my story. I said that if no one would spend the night with me, I would ask leave to have the light burning all night and would try it alone. "Look here," said he, "I will tell you what I will do. I will share your watch myself, and we will see what happens. It is my belief that we can find out between us. There may be some fellow skulking on board who steals a passage by frightening the passengers. It's just possible that there may be something queer in the carpentering of that berth." I suggested taking the ship's carpenter below and examining the place, but I was overjoyed at the captain's offer to spend the night with me. He accordingly sent for the workman and ordered him to do anything I required. We went below at once. I had all the bedding cleared out of the upper berth, and we examined the place thoroughly to see if there was a board loose anywhere, or a panel which could be opened or pushed aside. We tried the planks everywhere, tapping the floor, unscrewing the fittings of the lower berth, and took it to pieces. In short, there was not a square inch of the stateroom which was not searched and tested. Everything was in perfect order, and we put everything back in its place as we were finishing our work. Robert came to the door and looked in. "Well, sir, find anything, sir?" he asked with a ghastly grin. "You were right about the porthole, Robert," I said, and I gave him the promised sovereign. The carpenter did his work silently and skillfully, following my directions. When he had done, he spoke. "I'm a plain man," he said, "but it's my belief you had better just turn out your things and let me run half a dozen 4-inch screws through the door of this cabin. There's no good never came of this cabin yet, sir, and that's all about it. There's been 4 lives lost out of here to my remembrance, and that is 4 trips. Better give it up, sir, better give it up." "I will try it for 1 night more," I said. "Better give it up, sir, better give it up. It's a precious bad job," reported the workman, putting his tools in his bag and leaving the cabin. But my spirits had risen considerably at the prospect of having the captain's company, and I made up my mind not to be prevented from going to the end of this strange business. I abstained from Welsh rarebits and grog that evening, and did not even join in the customary game of waltz. I wanted to be quite sure of my nerve, and my vanity made me anxious to make a good figure in the captain's eyes. And that is all. It's getting good, I think. So we'll be at chapter 4 tomorrow. Have a wonderful Thursday, and I will be live at 5 tomorrow. Bye-bye. Love ya. Be sweet. Don't be ugly.